Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. You've probably been seeing the news about the wildfires raging across Southern California right now, with those strong Santa Ana winds. It's a pretty scary situation. We're going to be focusing on the Eaton Fire specifically,
Yeah.
which is burning near Altadena and Pasadena. I think a lot of people are following this one pretty closely.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the most concerning fires that we're tracking right now.
And the reason we wanted to do a deep dive on it is just because things are changing so rapidly.
Yeah,
This morning the fire was at 2,227 acres.
right.
And in just a few hours, it exploded to over 10,000 acres.
Yeah, it's over 10,600 acres now.
Yeah.
It's just incredible how quickly these things can escalate.
Yeah. I mean, when you see those numbers, it's kind of hard to wrap your head around what that actually looks like on the ground.
Absolutely, and especially with these Santa Ana winds.
Yeah.
They're gusting up to 100 miles per hour in some areas.
Oh, wow.
So it's just creating this incredibly volatile situation.
And unfortunately, we're already seeing the impact on the community. There have been 2 confirmed civilian fatalities,
Right.
a significant number of injuries reported,
Yeah.
and over 100 structures destroyed.
It's just heartbreaking to see the devastation that these fires cause.
For this deep dive, we've gathered news articles, incident reports from Hell Fire, and real-time social media updates. So we're really trying to get a sense of what's happening on the ground as it unfolds.
It's important to have as much information as possible when you're dealing with a situation this dynamic.
Absolutely. Now, one of the things that I found really interesting reading through some of these reports is just how erratic this fire's behavior has been.
Yeah, it's definitely been a challenge for firefighters.
Can you talk a little bit about what makes this fire so unpredictable?
Well, a big part of it is those Santa Ana winds that we've been talking about.
Mm.
They're incredibly strong and they're constantly shifting directions.
Yeah.
So the fire is basically being pushed around in all sorts of unpredictable ways.
So it's almost like it has a mind of its own.
In a way, yeah. It's definitely not behaving like a typical wildfire.
And the National Weather Service is saying that this is one of the worst windstorms that they've seen in a decade.
Right. These Santa Ana winds are a regular occurrence in Southern California. But this particular event is exceptionally strong.
So it's kind of like a perfect storm for a wildfire.
Absolutely. You have these dry conditions, you have the strong winds,
Yeah.
and then you have something that ignites the fire.
I think a lot of people, when they hear about the Santa Ana winds, they might not fully grasp what that means in terms of fire behavior.
Right.
Can you kind of paint a picture for us of what it's like out there with these winds?
So imagine you're standing in a field and you've got a giant blow dryer pointed at you.
Okay.
That's kind of what it's like with these Santa Ana winds.
Mhm.
They're just whipping up the flames and spreading them incredibly quickly.
Wow. And I saw some footage of residents actually fleeing their homes with horses.
Yeah, it's been really striking to see those images. You have people leading their horses down the road with flames visible on the hillsides behind them.
And I think there was even footage of some homes catching fire live on TV.
Right. There's been a lot of dramatic footage coming out of the area. It really underscores the danger and the urgency of this situation.
Yeah, it must be terrifying for the people who are living through this.
Absolutely. And it's also incredibly challenging for the firefighters who are trying to contain the blaze.
Speaking of the firefighters, I was reading that they've been facing some real challenges with water pressure because of the winds.
Yeah, that's a big problem.
Mm.
When you're fighting a fire, you need a lot of water.
Right.
And when the winds are this strong, it can actually interfere with the water pressure in the hydrants.
So they're not able to get as much water on the fire as they need.
Exactly. And that makes their job even harder.
Well, let's go back to the beginning for a second. What do we know about how this fire started?
So according to Hell Fire, a fire started on January 7th, just before 6:20 p.m.
Okay.
It was near Altadena Drive and Midwick Drive. But the exact cause is still under investigation.
So they haven't determined yet whether it was human-caused or natural or...
Right. It's still too early to say for sure.
Okay. And obviously a lot of people have been impacted by this fire. Can you talk a little bit about the evacuation orders?
So the evacuation orders are pretty extensive at this point. They're impacting over 52,000 residents
Wow.
and about 20,000 structures. And that's across several communities: Altadena, Arcadia, Pasadena, Sierra Madre, and La Cañada Flintridge.
That's a huge area.
It is, yeah. And then there are also evacuation warnings in place for an additional 47,000 residents and 18,000 structures.
So, for our listeners who might not be familiar with what an evacuation warning means, can you explain the difference between a warning and an order?
Sure. So an evacuation order means you need to leave your home immediately. It's not safe to stay.
Right.
An evacuation warning means you need to be prepared to leave at a moment's notice.
So it's like, get your go bag ready.
Exactly. Make sure you have all your essential documents, your medications, anything you would need if you had to leave your home quickly.
And I imagine there are evacuation centers set up for people who have had to leave their homes.
Right? There are several evacuation centers open in the area.
I was reading a story about one elderly living facility that had to evacuate all of their residents.
Yeah, I saw that one too. It sounds like it was a pretty chaotic situation.
And they were just using whatever transportation they could find.
It really speaks to the dedication of those caregivers.
You know, they were putting the needs of their residents first.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's really heartwarming to see that kind of compassion in the midst of such a difficult situation.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the resources that are being deployed to fight this fire. It sounds like a pretty massive effort.
Yeah, it's a huge operation. There are over 700 personnel currently battling the Eaton Fire. They're working day and night.
Oh, wow. And what kind of equipment are they using?
They have 79 engines, 8 bulldozers, 2 water tenders, and 9 crews.
That's a lot of firepower.
It is, yeah. And they're also getting some help from the air.
Oh, really? I thought I had read that the winds were preventing the use of aircraft.
You're right, the winds have been too strong for firefighting aircraft to operate safely. But I think the conditions might be improving, so we could see some air support soon.
Well, that would definitely be helpful.
Absolutely. It would give firefighters a much-needed advantage.
I also read that the Los Angeles Fire Department has put out a call for all off-duty firefighters to report for duty.
Yeah, that's a sign of how serious the situation is. They're really pulling out all the stops to try to get this fire under control.
Well, it sounds like they're throwing everything they've got at it.
Yeah, they're definitely not giving up.
Now, I did see a little bit of good news. It sounds like FEMA has approved a grant to help with the firefighting costs.
You're right, FEMA has approved a fire management assistance grant. So the federal government will be covering up to 75% of the eligible firefighting costs.
So that will free up some resources for the state and local agencies.
Exactly.
Right.
It will definitely help them to keep fighting this fire and protect the communities that are at risk.
Okay, so we've been talking a lot about the Eaton Fire, but it's important to remember that this isn't the only fire burning in California right now.
Right, there are several other active wildfires burning in the region. The Palisades Fire, the Hearst Fire, the Woodley Fire.
And they're all being fueled by these same intense winds.
Exactly. So it's a very widespread and dangerous situation.
It's a stark reminder of how vulnerable we are to these kinds of events.
It really is. And it underscores the need for preparedness and vigilance.
And the red flag warning is still in effect until Thursday evening, right?
Yes, that's right. The red flag warning means that the risk of fire spread remains very high.
So anyone who lives in the affected areas should definitely be staying informed and following the instructions of local authorities.
Absolutely. And it's a good idea to have a plan in place just in case you need to evacuate.
Okay, so just to kind of recap what we know so far, we have this massive wildfire, the Eaton Fire.
Right.
It's burning very rapidly. It's being driven by these incredibly strong Santa Ana winds.
Yeah,
And the exact cause of the fire is still under investigation.
that's right. They're still trying to determine exactly what sparked this blaze.
But regardless of the cause, it's clear that these dry conditions, combined with those extreme winds, created a perfect storm for a wildfire to ignite and spread quickly.
Yeah, it's a really unfortunate combination of circumstances.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here in terms of the initial spread of the fire and the challenges that firefighters are facing.
Yeah, we've got a good overview of the situation now.
In the next part of our deep dive, we're going to delve a little deeper into the impact that this fire is having on the people who live in these communities.
I think that's really important to focus on. You know, we hear about the numbers, the acres burned, the structures destroyed, but it's easy to forget that there are real people behind those numbers.
Absolutely. We're going to hear some of their stories and talk about the resources
Yeah.
that are available to help them cope with this disaster.
You know, it's easy to get caught up in those numbers, right? The acres burned, the structures destroyed.
It's hard not to.
But we have to remember that there are real people behind those statistics whose lives have been turned upside down.
You're absolutely right. It's so important to remember the human cost of these wildfires.
Yeah, I was reading an article about a family who had to evacuate their home with just minutes to spare.
Oh, wow.
They grabbed their pets and a few precious belongings, and that was it.
I can't imagine the stress and uncertainty of not knowing if you're going to have a home to go back to.
Absolutely. It's a really traumatic experience.
And even for people who don't lose their homes, just the experience of evacuating, of being forced to leave everything behind,
Yeah,
that has to take a toll.
it does. You know, the psychological impacts of these events can be profound and long-lasting.
Are you talking about things like PTSD?
Exactly.
Yeah.
The fear, the anxiety, the loss of control, those are all things that can really impact mental health.
So, for anyone listening who might be going through this right now, or who has experienced a wildfire in the past, it's okay to ask for help.
Absolutely. There are resources available. There are people who understand what you're going through.
And recovery from something like this takes time.
It does. It's a marathon, not a sprint.
There are going to be good days and bad days, but there is support out there.
And it's important to remember that you're not alone.
Now, we've been talking about the impact on individuals, but these wildfires also have a ripple effect on entire communities.
Right. It's not just about the people who are directly in the path of the fire.
So what are some of the broader impacts that we're seeing?
Well, for one thing, businesses are forced to close, schools are disrupted, and the local economy takes a hit.
Yeah, I was reading an article about how these fires are impacting businesses that rely on tourism, especially those near hiking trails and national parks that have been closed.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
Those businesses depend on those visitors.
And when those visitors aren't coming, it hurts the whole community.
Absolutely.
And then there's the cost of rebuilding, which can be
Oh,
astronomical.
yeah. I mean, we're talking about homes, infrastructure,
Yeah.
and all that has to be paid for somehow.
And who ends up footing the bill for that?
It's a combination of taxpayers, insurance companies, and individual homeowners.
It's a huge burden to bear.
It is. And it's important to remember that certain communities are often disproportionately affected by wildfires.
Like low-income communities, rural areas, indigenous populations.
Exactly. They may have fewer resources to prepare for and recover from these disasters.
Yeah, they might also be more reliant on industries like agriculture or tourism that are particularly vulnerable to fire.
It's a really important point. We need to be mindful of those equity issues when we're talking about wildfire prevention and mitigation.
We need to make sure that everyone has the support they need to be resilient.
Absolutely.
But one thing that I find really inspiring is the way that communities come together to support each other during these times.
It's really heartwarming to see, people just step up and help their neighbors in need.
I've seen so many stories of people donating food, clothing, supplies, whatever they can spare.
Yeah, and volunteering their time to help with firefighting efforts or rebuilding homes.
It's amazing to see that kind of generosity and
It
compassion.
really is. It's a testament to the human spirit.
It reminds us that even in the darkest of times, there's always hope.
And that we're stronger when we work together. It really
Yeah,
is,
yeah.
and it speaks to that human desire to want to help others when they're in need.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of brings me back to something you were saying earlier about the power of technology,
Okay,
in terms of wildfire management.
right.
I remember you mentioned early warning systems. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Oh, yeah. So early warning systems for wildfires, they're basically using technology to try and detect fires as soon as they start.
Okay.
So think like sensors and satellites and AI all working together to spot those first signs of a fire.
So instead of relying on someone happening to see the smoke or
Listening.
someone calling 911.
You could have a system that's constantly monitoring the landscape, looking for those telltale signs of a fire, like heat signatures or smoke plumes or even changes in vegetation patterns.
Wow. And how that information be used.
Well, the idea is that as soon as a fire is detected, an alert would go out to firefighters and emergency responders so they could respond much faster.
So it's all about getting ahead of the fire.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you can catch a fire in its early stages, you have a much better chance of containing it before it spreads out of control.
And obviously that could potentially save lives and property.
Absolutely. Early detection is key when it comes to wildfires.
Now, you also mentioned AI being used to optimize firefighting strategies.
Yeah, that's another really interesting area of development. So basically, they're using AI algorithms to analyze all sorts of data,
Okay.
things like weather patterns, fuel loads, terrain.
To kind of predict how the fire is going to behave.
Exactly. And then based on those predictions, the AI can recommend the most effective strategies for containing the fire.
So it's like having a supercomputer as your co-pilot.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
It's giving firefighters access to information and insights that they wouldn't have otherwise.
And could that help to keep firefighters safer?
Absolutely. If you can predict where a fire is going to spread, you can avoid sending firefighters into dangerous areas.
It's all about using technology to make wildfire management smarter and safer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think we're just scratching the surface of what's possible with these new technologies.
Yeah, it's really exciting to think about the potential here. But I also remember you talked about the importance of not forgetting about traditional knowledge.
That's right. Technology is a powerful tool, But we also need to respect the wisdom of those who have been managing fire for centuries.
The indigenous communities.
Exactly. They have a deep understanding of how fire behaves in their ecosystems, and they've developed practices that promote both cultural and ecological values.
So how do we bring those two perspectives together, the modern and the ancient?
Well, I think it starts with recognizing that we can learn from each other. Scientists and firefighters can learn from indigenous knowledge holders,
Right.
and indigenous communities can benefit from some of the tools and technologies that modern science has to offer.
It's about finding that common ground.
Exactly. And working together to create a more holistic approach to fire management.
Now, as we wrap up this deep dive, is there any final thought you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway for me is that wildfires are a complex issue. There's no easy solution. But there are things we can do.
Right.
We can be more proactive about reducing fuel loads. We can support policies that promote sustainable forest management. And we can invest in research and development of new firefighting technologies.
And we can support the communities that are affected by these fires.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to remember that we're all in this together. Wildfires don't discriminate. They can affect anyone.
So it's up to all of us to work together to find solutions.
Exactly. And I'm hopeful that we can.
Well, this has been a really thought-provoking conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And to all of our listeners out there, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the world of wildfires. Stay safe and stay informed.